Hello, welcome to this slideshow on existentialism. Today, what I want to do is cover what we've talked about with Marx and Hegel and kind of extend on that with existentialism. The last topic that we have in this section that I've titled Masters and Slaves will be about the panopticon. But today, I really want to give you just a good idea about existentialism and some of the themes that are involved in existentialism. And some of those themes are, the meaning of life and meaninglessness within life. Trying to think about how you can be, an authentic version of yourself, and looking at just different perspectives of the world. And so if you look at this beginning slide here, that's really what I'm trying to capture with some of these images is just how is it that we come up with not our own kind of paper version of our lives, but an authentic, real version of our lives. So I think a helpful way of talking about existentialism is just to kind of look at some of the historical figures that have been a part of existentialism and talk about some of the defining ideas that they had within it. And namely, who I want to use here are the people that I have on this slide. So to start off with, let's look at the far left philosopher here, Soren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is known as the father of existentialism, and he primarily is an interesting figure in the sense that he had a great reverence for Hegel, but at the same time rejected Hegel's main idea of collective consciousness. One of the big things that Kierkegaard says about Hegel is that he feels there's a kind of arrogance to Hegel's claim of having absolute knowledge or being able to understand absolute knowledge through this dialectical pattern that he sets out. Kierkegaard thinks that the dialectical pattern is interesting, but ultimately he rests his philosophy on what he calls this idea of inwardness. And for him, he really abhors this notion of a collective consciousness, or what Nietzsche, the next philosopher we'll talk about, ultimately calls a herd mentality. For him, the individual subject, is super important in thinking about philosophy in general because it's our subjective experience that we use to make sense of the world. And in fact, he's extremely suspicious of the notion of objectivity, so much so that he goes on to define it as just the subjectivity with which everyone can agree. And ultimately, big kind of authority figures are a problem for Kierkegaard because he thinks that as individual subjects, we rely on our subjective experience, and there can't really be things like the church, which he rails against, or scientific communities, which he also has things to say against. We can't have those types of authority dictating the rules of our own life. And so one of the primary ideas that Kierkegaard fights back against in Hegel is again that idea of collective consciousness, and he focuses a lot more on this idea about inwardness, really in a couple of different ways. I think it's worth noting that one of the most interesting perspectives he brings to philosophy is that he doesn't claim authorship over a lot of his works. Instead, he chooses to use pen names. And one of his ideas behind that is, again, as you put yourself into a different subjective experience, as you explore different ideas about subjectivity, you will change your perspective about what it is you're experiencing in your life. And so Kierkegaard is very well known for having used different pen names in a lot of his writings, and of even using different formats in his writing, using different types and styles of writing. we know that there was this kind of big event in his life where he was meant to get married, and then at the last second decided that he wasn't going to marry this girl, and he spent rest of his life kind of lamenting over this fact and trying to come to terms with it. And in thinking about that connection of his life work going around this notion of subjectivity, it's interesting that he would choose to live his life in a particular sort of way, where something that may have made him very happy ended up being something he rejected. And so one of the ideas centered around existentialism is this idea of thrownness. And Kierkegaard, in one of his phenomenal works, Either Or, describes this as basically saying that no one is really asked when they wish to enter life, and no one is asked when they wish to leave life. And this is a big claim of existentialism, because ultimately it's pointing towards the fact that we don't choose life. In some ways, life actually chooses us. We don't choose the circumstances around our life. We don't choose any of the facts that lead up to our existence. And nevertheless, our existence comes to us. And so, if there's one philosopher you're probably really familiar with from the existential tradition, it's probably the next philosopher I'm going to talk about, Nietzsche. And one thing that I think is an interesting contrast with Kierkegaard and all of the other philosophers that call themselves existentialists afterwards is that Kierkegaard is also a very big Christian philosopher. He is read in seminaries for his theological insights, but at the heart of it, Kierkegaard makes some of the strongest defenses of Christianity, even though he also makes some of the strongest attacks against organizations like organized church or organized religion. And he is separate from most of the other existentialist thinkers in that he strongly regards one of the biggest subjective experiences as a religious experience. Nietzsche is very famous for the line that he stole from Hegel. And Hegel, when he's writing the Phenomenology of Spirit, talks about how as people start to move past their tradition, that inevitably there's this kind of confrontation with religion. And he uses this phrase, God is dead. And Nietzsche takes that and puts it in 2 or 3 different places in his writing. And so people give Nietzsche credit for that saying, God is dead. But ultimately, it actually goes back to Hegel, who also was a seminary student at one point. And what Nietzsche means by this, people always take this and kind of think of it as like the anarchist cookbook of philosophical sayings. But in reality, what Nietzsche means by this is that he's talking about the fact that modern society is having more and more people leave churches, and they have to make sense about their society from the perspective of the fact that their society is moving beyond the church. He has lots of other vicious things to say about Christianity and the church as well, but what I want to focus on is the main kind of thrust of his arguments, and that has to do a lot more with this idea of what he calls the will to power. And the embodiment of the will to power is part of a person that he calls the Ubermensch, which is sometimes translated as the Superman, or literally the Beyond Man. And what Nietzsche has in mind when he's talking about the will to power is the fact that each individual has within themselves the will to do certain things, to get things done. And from Nietzsche's standpoint, the people who live the most dangerous sort of life, the ones who are willing to take chances and take risks and push themselves to excel beyond ordinary measures and ordinary points, those are the people who embody the human spirit the most. And within this, there has to also be an understanding of kind of this reasonable kind of goal that people shoot for. And for Nietzsche, he's all about going past even that reasonable goal and trying to become more than just an ordinary individual. And so this quote that he has down here at the bottom, which I think is very interesting, he says, the world is the will to power and nothing else. You are the will to power and nothing more. It actually brings a pretty good perspective of what Nietzsche is talking about there, because from his own standpoint, we write these kind of amazing epic poems about like the history of like humanity, and we often think of human beings in very high regards as far as the achievements that we've accomplished. And from Nietzsche's standpoint, like those even the most amazing kind of achievements that human beings have accomplished have always been tethered to the traditions that have propped them up. And for him, being able to break away from those traditions, to break away from just our ordinary kind of human assumptions, to break away from what, again, he calls the herd mentality, and seek recognition and meaning beyond that. And again, not recognition from other human beings, but recognition from our own kind of spirit of like travel and wonder. That to him is a much more meaningful sort of existence. And so the other quote that I have there, live dangerously, he says this in a very interesting context, where he talks about making enemies out of your friends, sending your ships to uncharted waters, building your house on the slopes of Vespus. And he contrasts it with, the kind of shy deer that live in the woods. And even though they have a life, it's not a very meaningful sort of one. And so Nietzsche is studied and misinterpreted in the history of philosophy by lots of different people. But one of his big ideas, again, is that idea of the will to power, and that individuals within themselves have the ability to live a life that exceeds even their own expectations. And so moving to that, the last group of people I have here on the far right is actually a photo of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. And both of them are philosophers in their own right. Sartre is considered to be one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th, or the 21st, I should say, century. I actually think that Simone de Beauvoir was a better and greater thinker than Sartre, and I'm in the minority of people who believe that. And I'll explain some of my reasons for that a little bit later on. But I want to focus on this quote, which is given credit to Sartre. And in this, he kind of summarizes the idea that people typically use to explain what existentialism is. He says that existence, or being, sometimes as it's translated, precedes essence. And what he means by this is that if we go back, especially so we're talking about in the mind-body problem, most philosophers tend to focus on what we might call essentialism, and that is what is the essential quality of metaphysics or knowledge or whatever it may be that we're talking about that makes that thing what it is. And Sartre says before you can even have a conversation about that, right, before you can even start looking at these kind of a priori, a posteriori distinctions, right, before you can start saying that the mind is more important than the body, or that the body, right, constructs the concepts of the mind, he says that we have to take into account that before any essence exists, there's already an existence that's there. And so this saying that being or existence precedes essence is really just this qualification of saying that anything that we look at in philosophy has to already begin with the fact that there is an existence there before there is ever an essence to that. And so anything that we look at to say is essential for existence is kind of putting the cart before, or the horse before the cart, whichever way that saying goes. And so I want to take a deeper kind of look at both of these philosophers' lives as well, and how it connects with existential thought for this next slide. So one of the main ideas in existentialism is a focus on the absurdity of life. Each one of the three groups of people that we were just talking about, each of them focus on absurdity from different standpoints. Kierkegaard gives the story of the clown in his book Either Or. It's really interesting. I'm going to read the quote for a moment here. He says, "A fire broke out backstage in a theater. The clown came out to warn the public. They thought it was a joke and applauded. He repeated it. The acclaim was even greater. I think that's just how the world will come to an end, to general applause from wits who believe it's a joke." And so what he's getting at in this quote is that we find ourselves in all kinds of predicaments that at the end of the day end up becoming forms of absurdity. And in this, the clown is the least likely to give a serious kind of injunction to the people who are in the play. And so it makes sense that they see this clown coming out and saying, "Hey, there's a fire in the back." And there's just all these kind of miscues that are involved in this single story about, again, how the clown is trying to warn people twice that there is a disaster happening in front of them. And they follow from these cues that that's not true. That's not the case at all. And so looking at this, a lot of existentialists focus on the fact that life is absurd in this same kind of direction. That we're surrounded by all kinds of absurdities. Um, if we can focus for a moment on what Marx says about alienation, I think that this is a really good kind of connecting point to thinking about the absurdity of life from a existentialist standpoint. Because on one end, he talks about the fact that the proletariat, these propertyless laborers, ultimately become alienated from the product of their labor as that product asserts power over them. We've already talked about that a little bit. But as they try to earn that money, as they try to earn more money to make up for that deficit of value that's lost through their productivity, the purpose of that money itself becomes less useful and significant. And sometimes people realize this and they fall into kind of like a despair. Sometimes people don't realize it, and that makes the situation even more absurd because they just continue to spin the rat wheel and work harder and harder and get more and more frustrated by the things that are completely out of their control. I remember when I worked for a hospital for a while. I worked in the registration department, and there would be times when we would have patients come to us, and their doctors had sent us over through this very big kind of emergency. And in order to get people checked in, we would have to have paperwork from the doctors. And the doctor's office would understand more than anybody else the necessity of getting that paperwork over to us. And yet the people who are in control of that paperwork sometimes wouldn't feel motivated like to send it over. They're just like, no, I've got a lot of other things I have to take care of first. And so in that same way, Marx points to this kind of absurdity that exists within labor relations. And if that's not enough, on the flip side of that, when we look at it from the bourgeoisie standpoint, the property owners, they become dominated by the cycle of monopolization that happens. As they become competitive with other owners, they have to monopolize more and more property. And ultimately, as they do that, as they're trying to hold on to more things than the people who have a lot of property as well, that sense of ownership actually begins to fall apart simply from the fact that they own so much. Like what the meaning of ownership actually is changes. And again, if we go back to that idea of dialectical materialism. From Marx's standpoint, there comes a point at which, the price of things like bread are just so expensive that you literally have to bring in the money of a country, in barrels, like in wheelbarrows, in order to pay for something like bread. And when that happens, people aren't going to just sit back and work a million hours so that they can afford a loaf of bread and work to their death. From Marx's standpoint, that's when people rise up. They look at the absurdity of the situation and they say, like, enough is enough. This is a complete absurdity. If you look at that bottom right picture on this slide, it's a picture of a mall. And I think that's a really good example of this kind of monopolization of the bourgeoisie. Because within the mall itself, when malls first open, they tend to have extremely expensive places for people to set up their shop. Sometimes the anchor stores get a really good deal and in being there. Sometimes even the anchor stores themselves actually own the entire mall. And what is the story of almost every mall that exists is that it doesn't become sustainable for those stores to have these kind of high prices for people to get these things that they can start purchasing off of places like Amazon and so on and so forth. And so they continuously start shutting down. And what's left over after that business has gone elsewhere is just this kind of abandoned place that is without a purpose. And so that's really, in thinking about existentialism, a good idea for accessing this point about absurdity. Because ultimately, from an existentialist standpoint, life itself is a big absurdity. Life is full of absurdities in all kinds of ways. And in fact, life itself is actually an absurdity. Every life exists under the condition of death. As my girl Lana Del Rey says, you and I were born to die. And in thinking about that, you can almost see the fact that there maybe is no meaning that's inherent in life. Because if every life exists under the condition of death, then it seems as almost that there is no meaning that could be assigned to a life that supersedes the fact of its existence, right? That it will one day cease to exist. And so from this, there's different perspectives that you can take about this kind of master-slave relationship of life and death. And again, every master-slave relationship in some way has an absurd kind of component to it. And I've tried to use some pictures here on this slide to help you think about just how absurd certain master-slave relationships are. So if you look at the picture of the chicken, it's one of my favorite comics, right, where the chicken's looking at the rooster and she's saying, "Oh my God, again I catch you beating the children." And it's got these these cracked open eggs with the whisk beating together the different eggs. There's a Far Side t-shirt that I used to love, where it had this cow grilling hamburgers, and two people would come by, or two cows come by and look at the cow and say, "You're sick, Jesse, sick, sick, sick," right? But if you look at these pictures, in some ways you can see it's not too far of a stretch what life is like in these places. So the hand that's giving milk obviously is an absurdity. But then again, when you think about it, right, how different is that from getting milk from a cow? And again, the idea behind this is, if you focus a lot on life and the relationships that exist within life, you are bound to uncover all types of absurdities that exist. I want you to think about this for a second. If I told you, hey, let's do that thing that we always do. Let's go get a chicken and cut that chicken up into small little pieces, and let's pick some potatoes and let's cut those potatoes up into the shape of waffles. Let's grab some tea leaves and filter water through those leaves and put copious amounts of sugar in there. And then for good measure, let's slaughter a pig, cut the pig up into little bitty strips and put that over the chicken. And then let's take all this stuff that we've put together and put it on slabs of wood where we'll sit there and chew pieces of it until it falls down our throat. You would think that's a very weird way of saying, hey, right, let's go get some Chick-fil-A today. But in looking at that, right, like if you look at that one picture, think about how much goes into making that one picture work and how absurd that all is. And of course, I know some of you are probably thinking, well, you forgot, right, to add the donuts to the sandwich, right? There's so many different ways in which life is just full of these absurdities. And again, the main one is that every life exists under the condition of death. And so what we've really been talking about on this slide about the absurdity of existence is a point that Jean-Paul Sartre really makes for existentialism. And ultimately, from Sartre's standpoint, absurdity is something that you don't fully escape from in life. But you shouldn't get caught up in life as this kind of meaningless task just because it's absurd. He goes back and forth and plays with this idea of absurdity throughout his writing. What I want to focus, though, on is a point that kind of goes beyond absurdity. And so I want to look at some of the big themes in existentialism and three of those main themes. And so let's take a look here. The three kind of points that I would look at in existentialism really have to do with these three key ideas. Again, the idea of thrownness. You don't choose the circumstances of your life. As Kierkegaard notes, you're thrown into existence. So you don't choose your siblings. You don't choose your parents. You don't choose what customs or cultures you're born into. You don't choose your level of wealth. You choose absolutely nothing about your life or any of the circumstances that surround it. And yet you are, from the moment you are born, set about with all these different choices before you to mold and sculpt the life that you end up living. Again, what we were talking about with this idea of absurdity, everything in life, including life itself, is kind of this irrational and ridiculous sort of arrangement. And so we can see these kind of master-slave relationships that exist everywhere, but also the interpretation of those relationships leads to absurdities as well. And based off of these two facts, from Sartre's standpoint, he again focuses on this theme, and this is an idea that falls with under Nietzsche and Kierkegaard as well, but Sartre really articulates it pretty well as this notion of authenticity. In order, right, to have an authentic existence, you need freedom, and you need that freedom in order to be able to assert that authentic existence in this world that is very absurd and which you have been thrown into. And so I realize that may not seem like the happiest kind of philosophy that exists. And one of the ideas behind existentialism is, again, we're not going to talk about what we think is the essential quality of life, but we want to deal with the truth of existence, right? What is existence as it appears and as it's unfolding? What is it actually like? And maybe more importantly than just what it's like, right? How do we live? Like, how do we exist? What does it mean to actually be? And in that regard, I want to talk about the final part of that first slide that I had. So it was not just a picture of Jean-Paul Sartre, but it was also a picture of Simone de Beauvoir. And a few things I want to mention about Simone de Beauvoir. First of all, she is the first woman that we are taking a look at, and we are 2/3 of the way through this semester, and that's interesting in and of itself. And I'll talk more about that when we get to feminism. But aside from that, I want to also acknowledge the fact that Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir have both come under fire for a kind of scandalous past that they had, and I've had people ask me in the past about their kind of like relationship, which was very complicated. They were living together in France for most of their life, but they had an open relationship. So they had different sexual partners. They traded sexual partners sometimes. And really what they've come under fire for is how those relationships have manifested, whether or not they were using people in these kind of sexual triangulations. I think that there are interesting arguments in both directions about that, and I'm not a scholar on the history of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir in that sense. I focus a lot more on their readings than on the kind of surrounding literature about them. So if you're interested in that, I can point you to some more sources about that particular kind of story. But what I actually want to focus on, because again, she is the first female philosopher, woman philosopher that we have taken seriously this semester. And I want to focus on what her contribution was, not just to existentialism, but to philosophy at large. And so she takes a look at this notion of absurdity, and she ultimately replaces that idea with her idea of ambiguity. The picture that I have here in the center is a picture of her book called The Ethics of Ambiguity, which she wrote in 6 months. Her most iconic work is considered to be a book called The Second Sex, which we will read some excerpts from when we get to feminism. But I actually think that The Ethics of Ambiguity is her most interesting work, and I have not read all of her works, so that is not a full opinion, but I have read a lot of her works. And in looking at The Ethics of Ambiguity, she really talks about this whole history of philosophy. She again gives Hegel credit for trying to kind of compose this philosophy that keeps in mind all the philosophers beforehand and possible movements afterwards. But where she really breaks away, not just from Hegel, but all of the other philosophers, is in her discussion about ambiguity itself. I want to read this quote really quick. I know it's a little bit of a longer quote, but I think it's also an interesting part of her philosophy and what she has to say. And so she says, regardless of the staggering dimensions of the world about us, the density of our ignorance, the risks of catastrophes to come, and our individual weaknesses within the immense collectivity, the fact remains that we are absolutely free today if we choose to will our existence in its finiteness, a finiteness which is open on the infinite, and in fact, any man who has known real loves, real revolts, real desires, and real will knows quite well that he has no need of any outside guarantee to be sure of his goals. Their certitude comes from his own drive. What I want to talk about with that quote has a lot to do with the nature of freedom itself. And so within philosophy, one of the big discussions that people have is whether or not freedom actually exists. Is there just the perception of freedom? Are we confined by all of the variables that exist within the universe to a limited sort of existence? Or is there kind of a real freedom? And what she points out is that if we take a look at this idea of these kind of master-slave relationships, you can see ways in which people do not have authentic versions of themselves. They choose an existence that's safe. They choose an existence that doesn't, and again, going back to Nietzsche, kind of expound beyond these kind of boundaries that either society sets for themselves or that they set for themselves. And they choose instead to have this kind of safe life that in some ways is a complete 180 from who they actually are. And what she points out is that that's part of the nature of freedom, is that freedom has within its boundaries or within its grasp the possibility that you can live a very safe and meaningless life and be a pleasure thrill seeker sort of like person, but never really challenge yourself beyond these kind of banal forms of fatuous existences. And from her standpoint, that isn't a sad sort of idea. In fact, it's just one of a multitude of possibilities under the guise that freedom actually does exist. And guise is probably not the best word to use right there. From her standpoint, we are given these sorts of situations that are, again, as Sartre points out, absurd. But for her, they just remain ambiguous. We can't say one particular kind of meaning or the other about them until after they've happened, and they remain as a possibility within the possibility that they could all end. Again, let me say that one more time. They remain within the possibility, under the possibility that they could all end. And so because of that, she talks about within this book, The Ethics of Ambiguity, she talks about these kind of extraordinary circumstances that people find themselves in. She talks about the bombing of Dresden, and she talks about what it would be like, living in Hiroshima or Nagasaki when the atomic bomb goes off. And ultimately, she makes that as a metaphor for human life itself. She talks about that. She goes back over these other things that philosophers have said, that man is a thinking reed, or that we build our lives for the purpose of death. And she looks at all of those possibilities and she says it's only because real freedom exists that those possibilities exist as well. And she points out that under the condition of freedom, there is always the possibility that nothing can exist anymore. And that's what she means by the finiteness being open on the infinite, is that this can pan out in any number of ways, including the possibility that everything at one point can end. And if we can just think about this for a second in terms of what we're actually dealing with today, and dealing with a pandemic that could possibly wipe out every single human being, although that's highly unlikely, and I don't want to give anyone unnecessary anxiety over that fact. She would look at this fact of life and point out that within that fact, right, within the fact that you are living at a moment where you are acutely aware that your existence is contingent and that there is no reason to suspect that you will live much longer than any other person that you know. She points out under that condition, that's what allows you the greatest possibility to live life. It's having that kind of ambiguity. Again, not an absurdity from her standpoint, because absurdity is incorporating a meaning about your existence that has to be decided within the confines of freedom. And so again, from her standpoint, it's ambiguous. There is no meaning that can be assigned to it because there's freedom that you still have in order to be able to pursue whatever choice you decide to make. And I realize that that may seem like a kind of escape from what the other existentialists are talking about, but she really truly means that this ambiguity is the condition by which freedom exists, and that when it's already been decided for us, that's actually when we stop living an authentic sort of existence. And so she takes heavy issues with things like political orders that force their citizens to live particular kind of lives. She takes big issue with societies that force people into situations that they do not choose themselves. Because from her standpoint, the whole purpose of living, if there is a purpose behind it, is to pursue that kind of radical notion of freedom, of being able to do right things that bring you pleasure, but also things that challenge the notion of who you are yourself. And so she takes this very kind of comprehensive view of existentialism, and she tries to raise the stakes even higher by saying, it's all ambiguous. It's not an absurdity. It's not a fight that you have just against society itself, but it's actually the condition by which all human beings live and exist. It's a condition of freedom, and under that condition is always the possibility that it can all be over. It can all end. The universe can explode on itself tomorrow. You have no guarantees of anything. And for her, you can look at that in one perspective and you can despair. And she points out there are lots of people who end up with that kind of life, that end up with the life of what we might say the dependent consciousness, where they become a slave to someone else's desire, right? They resign themselves in despair. They lose hope. They live with great anxiety. And she says the good and reassuring thing about all of those existences is that they still leave open the possibility for real freedom. And so as long as that's happening, as long as there's people who still despair and who still have anxiety and who still dread different things that could happen to them, there's still also the possibility that it can go the other way and that you could discover something that completely changes your life. You can find something that makes you happier than you ever realized before. You can understand yourself in a completely new way. You can live an authentic life. And from that, I want to finish with the great philosophical ideas that we have from Calvin and Hobbes, because I think that this cartoon really does a good job of illustrating her own thought behind this. And so if you look at this, the little kid is looking at Tiger, and he's saying, do you think it's better to live in stupefying security or take risks and live life on the edge? And he says, I think it's better to accept danger and live to the fullest. And then they start scooting down the edge of the mountain. And he says, I take it by your silence that you agree. And of course, Tiger's been thrown off the edge. And so, Calvin and Hobbes always has the great philosophical insights here. But if you think about this cartoon for a second, one way that an existentialist might interpret this is that the person who takes the risk first is the one who maybe gets the biggest reward, and the ones who wait around, like the ones who become the dependent consciousness with the independent conscious, they're the ones who stand to lose more than anything else. And so a final kind of point that Simone de Beauvoir makes in The Ethics of Ambiguity that I also like is that she says one of the duties of freedom is to make sure that other people are freed as well. That there's no solitude that you can enjoy in the collection of thought that you are free while everyone else is enslaved. And it really kind of goes back to this point that we started talking about with Plato's cave at the beginning of the semester, where the reason why people go back into the cave instead of enjoying their life in the Isles of the Blessed is not just because they're good people who go down to help other people, but it's part of the condition of our own existence, is that we can't really enjoy freedom if we know that everyone else is confined. We can't enjoy our own conscious thoughts knowing that everyone else is enslaved by some other means. And so for her, she says that ethics itself is really this notion of understanding the best tactics and strategy for winning life and then pursuing that. At this point, I want to go ahead and finish out this discussion of existentialism. Again, if you have any questions for me, feel free to email me or post them on the board that we have. Have a wonderful day.